Ask anyone why a team failed or a person broke down, and you will almost always get a story about a relationship, a broken bond, a lack of trust, a rift between two people. We have built an entire culture, and now artificial intelligence models, around the assumption that human problems are rooted in social dynamics. But what if the root cause of a conflict has nothing to do with attunement? What if the person was simply operating on 3 hours of sleep, or working under flickering fluorescent lights? What if a software timeout was misconfigured, or the paperwork was just designed poorly? When large language models lean heavily into emotional, interpersonal explanations, we often assume they learned to be warm through human feedback. That bias actually originates much further upstream. These models were trained on the entire human textual record. They learned from a library of stories. Stories require very specific elements to be memorable: an agent, a motive, and a clear conflict. Ambient noise, hypoglycemia, administrative friction, and random statistical drift are enormous drivers of human behavior. They are almost never recorded because they make for terrible narratives. Nobody writes a memoir about the Tuesday they were mildly underslept. This is the narrative prior. Because human text overrepresents interpersonal drama and completely ignores physiological base rates, our models mirror that exact distortion. We have mistaken the structural requirements of a compelling fable for the actual mechanics of how humans operate. To test how deep this bias runs, we can look at the classic thought experiment of Robinson Crusoe. It forces a precise question. If a person has food and shelter, do they strictly need other humans to remain human? Crusoe functions for years in isolation because he carries an internal crowd. His language, his tools, his concepts, they were all built by others. Once a person is constructed by that culture, they can run surprisingly well offline, provided they have a rich physical environment to interact with. The moment Friday arrives on the island, the dynamic fractures. A second person brings companionship, but they also introduce hierarchy, obligation, vulnerability, and interference. Crusoe alone never has to negotiate whose interpretation of yesterday's argument is correct. Push the experiment to its extreme by comparing that lonely island to a forced slave gang. In the gang, you are surrounded by people, but every interaction is saturated with threat and domination. For many, that coerced proximity is far worse than absolute solitude. Proximity is not connection. To maintain baseline sanity, you need a world to engage with, and the autonomy to change your environment, and exit. You do not necessarily need a room full of people. To separate the need for people from the need for a world, we can look at the harshest laboratory available: solitary confinement. The severe psychological decay observed in solitary housing units, hallucinations, panic, cognitive breakdown, is widely blamed on social isolation. But a supermax cell strips out every non-human element as well. It removes weather, purposeful work, horizons, and all personal control. This chart maps the predictive power of variables on prisoner well-being in Norwegian closed prisons. It reveals the view from the cell and outdoor access predicted overall satisfaction just as strongly as relationships with staff. The physical environment pulled identical weight to human connection. Researchers attempted to test this exact variable in an Oregon maximum security unit with the Blue Room Project. They took a standard indoor exercise cell and projected videos of oceans, forests, and outer space on the walls. By simply reintroducing a visual world, they observed significant drops in violent infractions while holding actual human contact nearly constant. The damage we reflexively attribute to a lack of socializing is heavily driven by severe environmental starvation and trapped powerlessness. Minds break when they run out of world to process. We see the exact inverse of this problem in space exploration. Astronauts operate in highly constrained, hyper-cluttered artificial interiors. They are surrounded by highly trained peers. They have constant team interaction, ground control support, and intense social bonds. Yet they still experience profound psychological strain. NASA recognized that the friction was not a social deficit. The solution was not another team-building exercise. It was the cupola, a multi-window observation module installed on the space station to give the crew a sweeping view of the Earth. When someone is distressed, trapped, or exhausted, prescribing more social time is often the wrong medicine. Sometimes the fix is simply a window and a wider perspective. When confronted with the reality that physiological and environmental facts drive behavior, proponents of relational psychology make a clever pivot. They argue that because humans exist within interconnected systems, every explanation is technically relational. But an explanatory frame that can expand to fit any observed outcome is doing rhetorical work, not scientific work. If a theory cannot lose, it traps you in an endless loop where you can only audit your biases using the exact same vocabulary that created them in the first place. Think of the Grinch. The story claims his heart grew 3 sizes that day because a sudden burst of empathy makes for a great climax. The fable entirely ignores that his boots were too tight or that he might have finally slept well. We assign interpersonal motives to behavior because motives are easy to narrate. Adopting a philosophy that explains everything without risking falsification does not mean you have discovered the truth. It means you are locked inside a genre. So how do we debug human behavior without falling into the narrative trap? This diagnostic pyramid shows the proper order of operations. You start at the base. You check the structural and material causes. Is the rent due? Are they in physical pain? Is the room too loud? You exhaust the physical environment and the random dice rolls of daily life before you ever start interpreting relational friction. We are undoubtedly built by early socialization, and we carry the voices of others inside us everywhere we go. But once constructed, we do not require a live, constant audience to solve the problem of being ourselves. True human flourishing requires a connection to the physical world and the autonomy to choose your surroundings. You need interesting things to interact with and the freedom to walk through your own door. That is how you escape the tyranny of the story.